presentation on overused foundation plants and native alternatives. My name is Elaine Mills, and I'm a Master Gardener volunteer with Virginia Cooperative Extension. I'll be telling you a lot more about the different services that our unit, the Arlington Alexandria unit, provides to the public at the end of the presentation. Leslie Fillmore, who is our volunteer coordinator, is going to be monitoring the chat box, and she will be keeping track of questions that arise there. And at several points in the midway point and at the end of the presentation, I'll do my best to respond to those questions. Also present are our VCE agent, Kirsten Conrad, and several other experienced master gardeners, and they may also handle some responses to questions just simply in the chat box itself. This spring, I wasn't able to pay the usual visits that I make to my favorite local public gardens. And so instead, I began taking extensive daily walks around my neighborhood to get a touch of nature. And as I did that, it really dawned on me how similar the foundation plantings of many homes looked. I would see plants from the same set of the same limited palette of plants. For example, yew, nandina, euonymus, Japanese barberry, azalea, cherry laurel, and burning bush. I have been spending the last 10 years learning a lot about native plants, especially native shrubs, and using them in my own garden. And I thought it would be a great opportunity today to introduce what I've learned, share some of my experiences, and help others learn about plants that could help broaden their plant choices, plants that are both ornamentally attractive and that can be beneficial in our environment. So today, I will begin talking about some issues with certain shrubs and the advantages of using others. The first part of the presentation will be looking at invasive shrubs and proposing some native alternatives to those. At that point, we'll take a break and answer questions. We'll continue with 6 overused non-native shrubs. These are benign, they're not invasive, but they appear very frequently in our home landscaping, and I'll propose some native alternatives to those. Then I'll discuss a little more briefly 11 additional native shrubs. I'll briefly describe some best practices when you think about installing your shrubs. I'll give you some examples of foundation plantings with native shrubs in them, and finish up giving you some resources. So what are the issues with our typical traditional foundation plantings? Well, as I mentioned, they are based on a limited palette of plants. That means that they aren't contributing to biodiversity. So for example, if a certain disease develops or a certain new insect comes on the scene and attacks a certain species of plants, many people's plants in the neighborhood, throughout the neighborhoods will be affected all at once by that particular problem. These plants have been introduced from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and none of them have evolved with the local fauna. In addition, some have growth or disease problems, and in fact, some are invasive. Here's a definition of invasive based on a presidential executive order from 1999. That means that non-native, sometimes referred to as alien species, are introduced into a particular ecosystem, and they cause harm to either the economy, the environment, or human health. So, problems with invasive plants. Well, people might have an invasive plant in their own home garden. Here's an example right in my neighborhood. This household had a butterfly bush growing on this wall, and I noticed on a walk that all of a sudden a new butterfly bush had appeared in this little curb cut. Plants don't always stay in place. Animals wind and water can carry their seeds away from gardens. And beyond just this limited reach, plants can spread uncontrollably in our forests, parks, and other natural areas. When they do that, the invasive plants suppress native vegetation and they're destroying habitat for wildlife. And they have a number of characteristics that allow them to do that. First of all, they tend to be prolific seed producers, and those seeds germinate at a high rate. The plants also are noted for their rapid reach of maturity, and some of them can also spread rampantly through vegetative spread. Some of them have allopathic characteristics. That means that their roots exude certain chemicals that make it impossible for other plants to grow near them. And we've also learned recently that increased carbon dioxide levels that are occurring with climate change can give an advantage to invasive plants. There are some issues with plant choices. Most nurseries and online sources offer a large percentage of non-native plants. Some continue to actually sell species that have been identified as invasive. Some landscapers even recommend invasive species. And unfortunately, information about invasive species is not widely available. So, what are advantages of using native shrubs? Well, as I've mentioned, they will broaden our plant selection. They can contribute to biodiversity. They are adapted to our local climate, so they're more likely to be successful here. They have certain habits, certain traits that allow them to substitute for our overused and invasive non-native species. And they have ornamental qualities. For example, lovely blossoms, very attractive fall foliage. Some of them are even evergreens. Another very great advantage to using native shrubs is that they will, in fact, provide habitat for our local fauna. They can provide nectar and pollen for our pollinators, especially the endangered species of native bees with their flowers. The foliage can serve as sustenance for the caterpillars of the moths and the butterflies that we want to see in their adult stages. And many of the plants provide fruit for our endangered bird species and other wildlife. So we'll begin right now with native alternatives to invasive shrubs. And for those of you who registered for the course ahead of time, you should have received a handout. And this is a list, just a simple list. I have pairs of plants, the non-native plant, and then my suggested native plant that could serve as a substitute. These plants are specifically native to the mid-Atlantic region. A good many of them are native also to the eastern half of the United States. If there are any of you who are watching from a more remote region, you may or may not be able to use these plants, and you may want to consult with your local cooperative extension to learn about plants that are native to your area. As far as the invasive shrubs, these are shrubs that have been found to be invasive up and down the East Coast, and they are specifically named as invasive by Arlington County and the city of Alexandria here locally in Northern Virginia. So to begin, we'll start with Japanese barberry. This was introduced in 1875 and is now found to be invasive from New England all the way to North Carolina. It spreads both by its berries that are carried by birds and by creeping roots. It can form thickets in forests, and it has a competitive edge because deer aren't going to want to eat it. More concerning for us, even in our home landscapes, is that this plant is a nursery for deer ticks. The moist conditions that exist underneath the plant are very favorable both to ticks themselves and to the mice, the nesting mice, that can help serve as a host for any diseases that are spread. So if you wanted to find a shrub with an arching habit and fruit, you might want to consider our native common ninebark, Physocarpus aquilifolius. This is an upright, multi-stemmed plant. It varies from 3 to 10 feet in height, depending on the particular variety you're choosing. It's good for sun to part shade conditions and dry to moist soil conditions, and has 4-season interest, as I will illustrate. It has great graceful arching branches that are just absolutely covered with beautiful showy spring flowers. These are great for pollinators. It has attractive lobed green leaves, and these serve as a larval host plant for our Lepidoptera. It has summer fruit that develops, and then it remains and has a very interesting character in the fall, and actually continues on the plant in the winter. And also in the winter, you'll note the interesting exfoliating bark. There are many cultivars of common ninebark. Cultivars are plants, cultivated varieties that have been selected by plant breeders for certain features that they think will be attractive to folks for their home landscapes. So you can see a wide range of different foliage choices. The one disadvantage of choosing a plant that has these different colors of foliage is that the plant cannot serve as a host plant for caterpillars. The chemical composition of the foliage has been changed. It will have anthocyanins instead of chlorophyll. And so it just won't be recognized as a nutritious plant. The flowers will still be beneficial to the pollinators. And these cultivars occur in different heights as well. Diabolo, for example, is a shorter cultivar. Another invasive plant in our region was introduced from Asia way back in 1860, and it is invasive along much of the East Coast. It spreads prolifically from its seeds spread by birds, and it can form dense thickets, as you can see here, in the understory of forests. It can also spread once it arrives there by root suckers. If you're looking for a shrub with good fall color to replace this, you might want to look at Virginia sweetspire, Itea virginica. It's an upright plant, again with an arching or rounded habit. It reaches about 6 to 10 feet. It likes, again, sun to part shade and moisture conditions, moist to wet. And like the previous plant, has 4-season interest. It has lustrous leaves that develop. It is deciduous. Lovely spring flowers. These were in bloom not that long ago, and these flowers attract both bees and butterflies for their nectar. And here is where it really comes into interest. It has a flaming fall color, and it also develops fruit, and this persists through the winter. There are 2 cultivars that are very popular. One is Henry's garnet, which reaches about 5 to 6 feet, and Little Henry, a more diminutive cultivar, at 2 to 3 feet in height. All of them have the same flowers, the same fruit, and the same lovely fall color. Bush honeysuckle is particularly troublesome in Arlington and Alexandria. It was introduced way back in the 1800s from Asia for wildlife cover, but now it spreads well throughout our forest understory. The seeds are dispersed by both birds and small mammals, and it also can have infestations from root sprouts. The flowers, the fragrant flowers, are very attractive to pollinators, so they will be sometimes more drawn to those plants than they might be to the natives, and so it competes with those. The fruit that develops from the flowers doesn't provide the nutrition that birds need for their bird migration. So if you're looking for a shrub with fragrant flowers, I might suggest sweet shrub, Calycanthus floridus, another upright multi-stemmed shrub, about 6 to 9 feet in height. It likes sun to part shade conditions and moist soil. It can spread if you like to form colonies, or you can control the spread if you wish. Sweet shrub has aromatic leaves, very showy flowers, and these blossoms with the strap-like petals have a fruity fragrance that's been likened to strawberry and some of the citrus fruits. I use that particular straight species in my garden, and I also grow the Athens cultivar, which has these lime green blossoms, very fragrant flowers. Interestingly, this one particularly began blooming in April along with the straight species, and I still have some intermittent blossoms even now in early July. Butterfly bush, a very popular plant, regionally, was introduced from China in the early 1900s. And as I pointed out in that earlier slide, it can easily escape from cultivation. It is by some people considered the quintessential bush to plant for butterflies. But in fact, it provides only nectar for the adults, but it can't serve as a host plant for the caterpillar generation of butterflies. Unfortunately, I've just recently learned that this plant hosts the brown marmorated stink bug, which has become a pest in our region. So you'd want to steer clear of it for that reason alone. Sometimes what are considered to be sterile cultivars can actually revert to a fertile state. So what is a possible choice if you do want to attract butterflies to your garden? One choice is New Jersey tea, Ceanothus americanus, another upright multi-stemmed shrub. This is a bit more petite than some of the others I've mentioned. It reaches about 3.5 feet in height. Unlike the others, it can take dry to moist conditions, and that is possible because it has a massive deep root system, so it's very drought tolerant. I've actually recommended it as a hail strip plant in a parking lot, and it's done very well there. It's called New Jersey tea because the leaves actually still make, I don't think it's used that much, but it did make an excellent tea. It was used by different American Indian tribes, and it was the substitute plant when our colonists during the time of the American Revolution were boycotting British tea. The leaves serve as a larval host for butterflies. It has fragrant flowers in June. They just finished blooming recently, and they provide nectar for butterflies, bees, and many other insects. It develops this really interesting fruit, and that, as it dries, provides winter interest. Japanese spirea has also been designated as invasive in Arlington and Alexandria. It's invasive, in fact, through the whole mid-Atlantic. It was introduced quite a while back from Asia. In natural areas, it can create some dense colonies, and its seeds, small seeds, are dispersed by water and can remain viable for years. If you'd like a plant, a shrub with showy flower clusters, you might want to consider our native spirea, steeplebush, Spirea tomentosa. This is a mound-shaped plant. I just recently learned about it myself. This picture was taken when I visited a botanic garden in North Carolina. It reaches about 2 to 4 feet in height and likes moist to wet conditions in sun to part shade. It also has a 4-season interest. In the spring, it develops these attractive leaves, which are host for caterpillars of butterflies and moths. In summer, it develops these lovely flower spires with abundant pollen. They will develop these interesting seed heads that last into the winter, and then the foliage will turn this really attractive leaf color in the fall. Nandina is another very popular plant in our area. It was introduced from Asia about 200 years ago. It's now invasive from Virginia all the way to Texas, where it colonizes in the forest understory. And it spreads by a number of means, both from its seeds, which are carried by birds, by rhizomes, and it can actually reproduce just from simple root fragments. In our gardens, it can be problematic because the fruit is toxic to cats and to cedar waxwing birds. If you're looking for a shrub with attractive foliage and fruit, a native substitute might be strawberry bush. euonymus americanus. This is a very airy, open, multi-stemmed plant, a similar habit to the nandina, I feel. It reaches the same height, about 4 to 6 feet, and this plant prefers partial shade and moist conditions. The really outstanding feature of this plant is its unique fruit. The plant starts out in the spring with these really diminutive, very subtle, charming flowers. And in the summer, these develop into really stunning fruit with these brilliant coverings and then almost a day glow orange seed underneath. In the fall, it also develops really attractive foliage. Privets are another popular landscape choice for our foundation plants. This was introduced, the ligustrum species were introduced from Asia in 1852, and unfortunately they're now invasive throughout the Southeast. They can create impenetrable thickets, and they spread again both by seed and suckers and resprout from their roots. If you want a dense shrub with fruit, one of my favorites is possum haw, Viburnum nudum. This is another upright multi-stemmed shrub. It reaches about 5 to 12 feet. It likes moist to wet conditions in sun to part shade. It has really attractive lustrous leaves, the shiniest leaves of any of the native viburnum species, and it hosts the spring azure butterfly. Has attractive spring flowers, and native bees are attracted to these for the pollen. It's especially attractive in the fall. Again, the glossy leaves just take on brilliant colors, and it has very interesting fruit. The fruit begins looking almost a mint green in color, then it turns pale pink, then this deeper pink color, then blue and purple, and one cluster of fruit can actually be multicolored, and the fruit is very popular with birds. There are quite a few Asian viburnums that were introduced in the 1800s. These include double file, linden, seabold, and the tea species, and they're invasive in Virginia in a number of our natural areas where they form dense thickets. Another problem with this plant is that it can interbreed with the native cranberry viburnum, Viburnum trilobum. If you would like a shrub with fruit and fall color, you might want to look at another viburnum, another native, arrowwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. This is another one, multi-stemmed with a rounded shape. It reaches about 6 to 10 feet. My plant shown here started out in part shade under a tree, and when I lost that tree, it was in fact an invasive tree that died. Sunnier conditions developed, and this year it was just absolutely covered with these attractive flowers. It likes moist conditions. It has glossy toothed leaves, hence the name dentatum, and it's a host plant for the caterpillars of some of our moths. It has attractive spring flowers like the other viburnum, and they provide nectar for bees and butterflies. This fruit that is actually developing on this viburnum shrubs right now, and I'll give you a little more information about how you can make sure that your shrubs will be very fruitful a little bit further in the presentation. Arrowwood viburnum has really attractive fall foliage, and like the 9-bark, I wanted to point out that there are different cultivars that are available. And if you want to be sure that the foliage will provide nutrition for the Lepidoptera, you would want to steer clear of a cultivar like Red Feather, which has red foliage, not as a fall foliage color, but as its main foliage color during the growing season. So we'll take any questions here, Leslie.
Okay, we've got a couple. We did have some questions about whether or not these recommended natives are deer resistant. So if, as you continue to go through, if you know of any that are particularly deer resistant, that would be great if you could mention that.
Right. I should have made a point of listing that as a feature in each of the text boxes. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to be referring people to a set of fact sheets that I have developed along with a Master Gardener colleague, Mary Free, and she was particularly attentive to the question of whether plants were resistant to deer. So that is a feature that people will find specifically on the fact sheets.
Okay, great. Somebody asked if there is a native for bush honeysuckle, like a native bush honeysuckle.
Yes, there is one. I don't happen to mention it in this presentation, but I will show a picture. I don't describe it, but I will show a picture of it because one of our master gardeners, in fact, uses that in her garden. I think it's Diarvilla lonicera, and I'll point that out when we get to that point because there is a native one.
Okay, great. Okay, somebody asked your opinion on common milkweed. They have a whole bunch of it this year and they see lots of bees and one monarch. Is that something that you're going to discuss? Is that one of the plants you're going to discuss today?
Well, the milkweed plants are not shrubs. Those are perennials. And I was focusing on plants that could serve as replacements for foundation shrubs. But since we're talking about milkweed, I'll take a moment to discuss that. There are 3 types of milkweed that are locally native, maybe more than that, but there are 3 that are easily available. One of them is common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, and that one is very attractive to a variety of pollinators, and it's outstanding because it provides not just the nectar that the adult butterflies will be seeking, but it serves as a host plant for the caterpillar generation. So that's an outstanding support plant, and I would encourage use of that. The one reason why you might, if you have a smaller garden, might want to steer clear of the common milkweed that Asclepias syriaca is that it is a little more rambunctious in gardens. It tends to spread more. There are 2 other varieties. One is Asclepias incarnata, swamp milkweed, a little better behaved, and a more diminutive milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa. All 3 of them provide nectar for butterflies, and they are all host plants for the caterpillar generation. So female adult butterflies will lay their eggs, caterpillars will develop and be able to use the foliage of those plants as a host plant.
Okay, thank you. So we do have questions about where can you purchase native plants. The person has had the experience of going to the nursery and then, not being able to find some of these.
I'm going to be talking about that in our resources section at the end.
Great. Okay. Somebody asked if any of the native fruits that might be on these are edible for humans.
The one that is specifically edible is blueberry, which I'll be talking about as a substitute a little further on. Just thinking quickly over what I've discussed so far, these I'm pretty sure are all just edible for birds or other wildlife. Some of our native trees, for example, service berries, have fruit that can be enjoyed both by humans and wildlife. But I believe all the plants I'll be discussing today are mainly wildlife support plants.
Okay. And somebody asked, they said they had seen a lot of part shade and full sun suggestions. Can you point to ones that are full shade as well?
The strawberry bush, the euonymus americanus, the very airy one that had the really striking fruit. I've seen that growing in pretty dense forested conditions at Meadowlark Garden in their native plant forested area. I've seen it in Fern Valley, I believe, at the National Arboretum. So that would be a good choice there. And I'll be pointing out a couple of others as we get a little further on into the second half of the presentation.
Okay. Let's see. And another thing somebody was asking about was ones that were evergreen.
I believe I'll be talking about one of those as we get a little further along as well.
Okay. Let's see. I'm just checking. There's a lot of chat since we started the, the question answer session. Okay, let's see. Yeah, native evergreens. And somebody asked if is crepe myrtle a non-native?
Crepe myrtle is a non-native. It's not specifically listed here in Arlington and Alexandria as invasive, but I have seen it spread in the same manner that the butterfly bush did. I've seen it spread throughout my neighborhood. Volunteer plants will crop up in other people's yards. So it hasn't been declared an outright invasive, but it is, you need to pay attention to its spread.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll break there and we'll catch up with any other questions at the end.
All right, very good. So for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about some native alternatives to other non-native shrubs. These are shrubs that have not been designated as invasive. They aren't native to our region, but they are benign. The reason I'm talking about some alternatives is that the natives have very attractive features. In addition, they can provide that wildlife support that some of us are eager to introduce into our yards. And some of them will have multi-season interest, while the non-native shrubs maybe are just attractive in one season alone. So the first example of one of these overused shrubs is Asian azaleas. And these, of course, are noted for their glorious spring foliage, but I don't consider them especially noteworthy throughout the rest of the year. If you would like another plant, a native plant that has attractive spring flowers, you might want to investigate some of our native azaleas. One example of these is pinkster bloom azalea, Rhododendron paraclimenoides. It's a bushy suckering shrub about 3 to 6 feet in height. And this is a good example of a plant that will grow in part shade to full shade. And it likes moist conditions. The flowers, in addition to being showy, are fragrant. Most of the Asian azalea species that I'm familiar with at least, are not fragrant, but these are. And they attract bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds as well. I just learned recently that the leaves of this particular plant act as the host for 50 different caterpillar species. In my yard, I have this attractive hybrid cross, chop tank rose, and it has very attractive fragrant flowers. This is in a really shaded area of my garden. Another very popular landscape plant, which is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, has been suffering with many different disease conditions in our region lately. These involve fungi. There's also cold injury, drought stress with some of our new climate conditions, and nematodes. So if you're looking for an evergreen shrub, you might want to look to inkberry holly, which is one of our native hollies, Ilex glabra. It has a rounded form, and it can spread through suckering if you would like it to form a hedge. It reaches about 6 to 10 feet, and it tends to like moist to wet conditions in sun to part shade. This is a dioecious plant. That means that there are separate male and female plants, male flowers and female flowers on separate plants. And I'll be talking a little bit more about what that means as we go along. It has glossy evergreen foliage that can provide cover for birds. The flowers are fairly insignificant. We wouldn't particularly pay attention to them, but bees are very attracted to them for their nectar. And then in the fall, if you have male and female plants, fruit will develop on the female plants, and that provides nourishment for 15 different bird species. Another very popular plant, it's certainly in my neighborhood at least, is cherry laurel. This plant is native to Europe. It isn't actually declared invasive, but it is on the City of Alexandria invasive watch list. So they're keeping an eye on it for possible invasive tendencies. If you like the spire-like spring blossoms of this plant, I would suggest you consider sweet pepper bush, Clethra alnifolia, another upright to rounded shrub reaching about 6 to 12 feet in height. This is another one that does well both in sun to full shade conditions. If you have it in sun, you certainly want to make sure that you're keeping it moist because it tends to like the wetter soil. And this plant also has 4-season appeal. It has these attractive quilted leaves. They're shown here in spring, a light spring green color, and then they turn a darker green. It has fragrant summer flowers, spire-like flowers, and these attract a wide variety of pollinators, bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. And the flowers develop into this really interesting fruit. The fruit continues on through the fall, the winter, actually into the next spring, providing food for birds through that winter season. And it has glorious flaming yellow fall foliage. There are several cultivars that you might want to consider. One pink-flowered variety is Ruby Spice. Another is Hummingbird, which is a very diminutive white-flowered species. This plant is very popular in my neighborhood, especially this multicolored cultivar, Japanese euonymus. A problem that I've noticed with this cultivar is that it reverts back, some of the branches will revert back to the straight species. So you end up with this rather mottled, almost diseased look where the plant can't quite decide whether it wants to revert back to the straight plain green species or the multicolored look. If you'd like a shrub with attractive foliage, one of my favorites is black chokeberry. It's an upright multi-stem shrub. It can spread, but you can control the spread by cutting the suckers if you want it just to remain as a single discrete plant. It reaches about 3 to 6 feet in sun to part shade, and it tolerates a wide range of soil conditions. I forgot to include a photograph of this, but there is a small cultivar available called Low Scape Mound. And that is very diminutive. It's actually a ground cover plant in height. It will have all the same features of the full-sized straight species. So you might, if you're interested in a lower ground cover plant, you might want to look at that. Anyway, to take a closer look at this plant, it has very attractive foliage, these glossy leaves, and it provides nourishment for various butterfly and moth species. The spring flowers are attractive to bees, and this fruit is actually developing now. It will remain on the plant if uneaten through the fall and is enjoyed by birds. Another popular plant in our area is the mophead hydrangea. And this one, again, it is stunning during the summer months, but it really just has one season of interest. If you wanted to look for another shrub with large flower clusters, I suggest our wild hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens. It has a similar mound shape and also grows with canes. Now, the interesting thing about this plant is how fast growing it is. The recommendation is actually to cut it back to close to the ground in the late winter, very early spring before the growing season begins. And it will develop, it will reach 3 to 6 feet of growth in one growing season. And the flowers form on new growth. So the plant will be completely covered with flowers every year. It is another good example of a plant that likes part shade to full shade conditions. So another great one for those of you seeking shadier conditions. And it provides great wildlife support. It does that in a number of ways. It has large quilted leaves that provide nourishment for some moth species. The spring flowers are attractive to many types of pollinators. Here you see bumblebees, but I've seen many other insects visiting this. Now, the Annabelle cultivar, which has the larger flower heads, is a very popular cultivar. The unfortunate thing about this is that the flowers are sterile. They don't, as you can see, they don't have the same nectar and pollen that these do. So they're going to provide less support to the pollinators. The leaves still would provide nourishment to moths. So you might want to consider perhaps using both in your landscape. This one, if you like the larger flower clusters, and this one to provide the fuller support. Another quintessential landscape plant in our area is yew, which is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. And unfortunately, all parts of this plant are toxic, including the seeds of the red berries. Another native shrub with berries, very attractive, is winterberry, another of our native hollies, Ilex verticillata. Another one with an upright one with a rounded crown. And depending on the variety that you get, it can reach anywhere from 3 to 12 feet. It likes sun to part shade conditions and moisture to wetter soil. This is another example of a dioecious plant, one that has both male and female plants with separate flowers. And you'll want to have a pair of those for fruiting. Winterberry has attractive quilted leaves, and another example of one with dense foliage that will provide cover for birds. It has delicate summer flowers that have just finished blooming that provide nectar for bees and butterflies. And the fruit now on my shrubs is beginning to develop in right where all the flowers were. It's a pale green color, about this color right now. But as the season moves along, the fruit will develop into these lovely red berries, and it will be on the plant from summer through winter, and it provides food for 48 different species of birds. If you have wanted to get a red fruited variety, you might consider red sprite, that's the female, and you would pair that with a very specific male plant, the Jim Dandy cultivar. If you like the look of this orange fruited variety, that's winter gold, and the Southern Gentleman male acts as the pair to pollinate that female species. Very briefly, we'll look at some other attractive native shrubs. I wanted to single these three out because of their interesting flowers. They have other attractive features as well, but the flowers are especially noteworthy. First is buttonbush, Cephalanthus occidentalis. The flowers look almost like small satellites. These are attractive to a wide variety of insects, and I think even hummingbirds. This particular plant likes wetter conditions. I've seen it growing, for example, beside a pond and in the aquatic gardens in Washington. Witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, is the plant, the native shrub with the latest blooming flowers. These ribbon-like flowers actually develop on the plant in the late fall and early winter. So November and December, you'll be seeing these against other bare branches, really attractive. Mountain laurel just has these interesting, charming flowers. And the fun thing about this is that the anthers are attached to the blossom and they're spring-loaded. And when a pollinator, like a bee, lands for nectar, these will release and they will hit the insect with pollen. And so that the pollen will then be carried to another plant. We have some native shrubs. I've mentioned some already that have great fruit, but these are three more with really particularly nutritious fruit. Spice bush is another one that grows in shadier forested conditions, Lindera benzoin. This fruit is noteworthy because of its high lipid content, and that makes it especially nutritious for our fall migrating birds to give them energy. The American beautyberry, Calicarpa americana, has this absolutely splendid, abundant fruit, and it ripens over a long period of time. So it will be interesting in your garden for a long period, and it will also be available as a food source for birds for an extended period of time. And we mentioned fruit that can be consumed by humans. This is an example, and maybe people don't even realize this is a native plant. High bush blueberry, Vaccinium corymbosum. I also would like to mention some native shrubs with great fall color. Fragrant sumac comes in a tall, straight species format. This grow low cultivar of Rus aromatica I'm mentioning because if you're looking for a lower, close to ground cover height shrub, this one is very attractive. It has subtle flowers in the spring and then just this glowing fall foliage in the fall. Oak leaf hydrangea is one of the native plants that I think is becoming a little more popular in our area. I've seen it in a number of yards. It's attractive throughout the growing season with these interesting oak leaf shaped leaves. And then in the fall, those leaves take on a wide range of colors. Witch alder, Fothergilla gardeniae, has really charming white bottle brush shaped flowers in the spring, and then a wide range of colors, yellow, orange, and burgundy in the fall. And there are two additional viburnums that I'd like to mention. I discussed possum haw, Viburnum nudum, and arrowwood, Viburnum dentatum earlier. These are two more. There's maple leaf viburnum with you can see how aptly named it is. The flowers of this shrub are a little bit different than the others, have almost a pinkish cast and a slightly different shape. The tallest of the native viburnums is black haw, Viburnum prunifolium. It can reach almost tree-like heights, maybe 12 to 16 or 18 feet. Again, really attractive flowers for our pollinators and great fruit for birds. I'd like to briefly discuss some best practices when you're planting your shrubs. Most important, especially when you're thinking of foundation shrubs, you want to consider a shrub's mature size. It may start out looking like this, but you want to remember that by year 5, it may have a totally different size. So here are some suggestions of about how far away you should plant them from your foundation. You want to leave space both for airflow, access if you want to do any maintenance on the plants themselves, and certainly on your property. And I was reminded in one of the presentations during Master Gardener College that in our region, fire tends to spread on the ground. And if you have plants that are too close to your home, if they were to take light, they could allow the fire to spread to your home. So you want to allow plenty of distance between the plants and the wall of your home. When planting shrubs, you'd want to remove them obviously from your container and untangle and spread out any circling roots that will tend to form when they're in a cylindrical container. We're recommending that you dig a shallow planting hole 2 to 3 times as wide as the root ball. And the reason why you want to have a wide, shallow hole is that is going to encourage the natural horizontal root growth of that plant. When you're backfilling it, you want to actually fill it with the soil that you removed from the hole, the native soil. You don't want to amend that soil, even though you'll see on multiple sites, and I just noticed this online, almost every site recommends that you add all kinds of extra amendments. But if you do that, a condition called a perched water table will develop. Water won't flow because the soil structure will be different around the root ball and in the surrounding area. Water won't flow through properly, and the roots themselves, because of the difference between the amended soil and the surrounding soil, won't want to move beyond that. So you want to just simply put the remaining soil back down, tamp that down. You can add compost as a top dressing up above, but don't add that down below. As far as watering shrubs, obviously you'll want to water it when you first install it, and newly planted shrubs will need regular, consistent watering for several years. You'll want to water it pretty frequently at first after planting it. Then you can taper off to every few days, of course, taking into account whatever rainfall has occurred. I use a rain gauge in my garden so I can really keep track, and especially with some of these heavier cloudbursts, we may get even up to 2 or 3 inches in one rainfall. So I'll try to use the rain gauge to keep track of that. And over the first couple of years, you'll want to make sure to water weekly the equivalent of about an inch of rain if you don't get the actual rainfall. Some shrubs, I'm thinking particularly of hydrangeas, may wilt in hot afternoon sun. You want to be especially watching out for any early morning wilting. That'll be an indication that that plant really needs water. As far as mulching shrubs, be sure not to use more than a 3-inch layer of either leaf mulch or bark mulch. And if you mulch it too deeply, that can cause a number of problems. Either the mulch will prevent water from getting down into the root ball, or if you have a waterlogged area, the mulch will actually retain the moisture, and that could lead to root rot. If you have heavy mulching, that will cause suffocation because there'll be reduced oxygen levels to the roots, and the roots may even want to grow up into the mulch itself. That happens especially when there's the practice of volcano mulching that usually happens around trees, where huge mounds of mulch are built up around the trunk of a tree or a shrub. So steer clear of that, please. I would actually recommend using ground covers as a green mulch. And I'll be talking about in our resources some possible sources of native ground covers. There are some of the very popular ground covers: liriope, periwinkle, Japanese pachysandra. All of those are invasive, and I would suggest perhaps finding a native ground cover if you can. I mentioned that there are some special considerations you need to take into account for fruiting of your plants. If you have dioecious species like the 2 I mentioned, these 2 hollies, winterberry and inkberry, they're going to have separate male and female plants. So you want to plant those in fairly close proximity in order for the female to bear fruit. The plants obviously must both bloom at the same time so that pollen can be carried from the male to the female plant. If you wanted to plant more than 2, one male can service many female plants. And as I mentioned before, you want to look for paired cultivars. One particular consideration for the native viburnums: they are monoecious. That means that male and female parts are on the same plant, but they're not particularly self-fertile. So they require cross-pollination between different variants in order to produce fruit. So you can do one of 2 things. You can either get the straight species, the so-called wild type, and you would see that 2-part scientific name on the label. You would want to get that from several different nurseries or growers to make sure that the plants were genetically different. Or you could get 2 different named cultivars of a species. So if you wanted to get Viburnum nudum, the possum haw, for example, you could get the brandywine cultivar and the winterthur cultivar, which both bloom at the same time. There would be cross-pollination between the 2, and they would both have fruit. And finally, for a little bit of inspiration, I wanted to include some photographs to show you how some of us master gardeners actually use native shrubs in our own foundation plantings. Here's Virginia sweetspire planted at our Master Gardener headquarters at the Arlington Community Center. Glorious fall foliage. Here in our Glencarlyn demonstration garden, we have this really attractive oak leaf hydrangea, and the winterberry hollies are in fairly shaded conditions here underneath this tree. Here's an example of how both sweet shrub and the inkberry holly were used in slightly more formal manner. These are some plantings outside an office area where my husband works in Maryland. One of my Master Gardener colleagues uses oak leaf hydrangea, and here's a native tree, a native magnolia at the corner of her home. The home is right here. And here's how she used that grow low fragrant sumac as a delightful native ground cover. And this will turn the brilliant colors of red and orange in the fall. Another Master Gardener friend doesn't have any lawn in her front yard. She uses arborvitae here right next to the home. Here are the winterberry hollies, male and females. They don't happen to be fruiting in this example here in this layer. And here's an example of that native bush honeysuckle that I mentioned earlier. And here's Virginia sweetspire. This is probably the little Henry cultivar because it's fairly small. The same Master Gardener has black haw, the Viburnum prunifolium. You can see the taller viburnum, almost a tree-like shrub at the back. And she has a whole row of inkberry holly that she uses as a hedge in the side of her property. The next few pictures are from my garden. I have arrowwood, here a cluster of them around a tree at the front. Here's how I've used oak leaf hydrangea in front of my house, surrounded by some perennials. You can't quite see it, but there are several of the little evergreen Ilex glabra, the inkberry holly, that are scattered among the perennials here to give evergreen structure throughout the year. Here along the side, this picture was taken a couple of years ago. I originally had a 9-bark next to a garage that was here, and then I decided it was really growing a little too large. It wasn't one of the smaller cultivars, so I moved that to another area. But you can see how attractive these wild hydrangeas are growing along the edge here. Black chokeberry that I mentioned is a very attractive plant for its foliage, flowers and fruit is here, and the small Virginia sweetspire here. And this picture was just taken a few months ago this spring. You can see that native viburnum in full flower. It's now in fruit. Along the side of my home, I have that tall black haw, the Viburnum prunifolium, the black chokeberry. This is a red chokeberry. I didn't describe this one, but it has a more open, airy kind of a structure. These, again, are those native hydrangeas. This is a a north side of the building. So they're in shade for part of the day. You can't quite see it, but this is that strawberry bush, that airy bush that had the very attractive fruit here behind it, and across the way are the smaller little Henry Virginia sweetspire. And I wanted to point out that Master Gardeners themselves can sometimes make mistakes, and this tree really shouldn't have been planted. This Cornus alternifolia, the pagoda dogwood, was really planted a little too close to my home. So I've had to keep an eye on it and prune it away. There's a good amount of space between all of the shrubs and the foundation. Finally, I'd like to mention some resources that you may find helpful. These are resources for our Virginia Cooperative Extension. Now, as I mentioned, we have headquarters at the Fairlington Community Center, but they aren't open right now. But you can reach our help desk at this address right here. It stands for Master Gardener, Arlington, Alexandria. And through the help desk, via email, you can find out about getting a soil test. If you have insect or disease problems, you can send photos and learn more about those. You can get answers to other questions on plant care. We also maintain 5 different demonstration gardens in Arlington and Alexandria, and the locations of those are given on our website. And we also strongly encourage you to register for additional classes in our lecture series. Virginia Cooperative Extension in our area is supported by a nonprofit group, Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, and we support in a number of ways. One of them is through our website, mgnv.org. And on that site, under plants, the pull down menu, you'll find what we refer to as the tried and true native plant fact sheets. They will give you lots of information about many native plants, not just shrubs, but trees, perennials, ground covers, ferns, and grasses. And you'll be able to see pictures, get a lot of care information. We have a small set of sheets referred to as the best bets sheets. If you're looking particularly for plants for wet conditions, dry conditions, ones that will attract pollinators, can act as cover crops, that set of fact sheets will be interesting for you. And we also have a third set of fact sheets that have been completely updated, describing the invasive plants, plants that have been designated as invasive in Arlington and Alexandria. I also wanted to point out that our website has weekly articles on gardening practices, and one set of articles that will be of particular interest right now are those on how to deal safely with mosquitoes and ticks. If you've been interested in following our Zoom sessions, you can actually see the recordings of those sessions. What you'll do is you'll go to the public education menu drop down, and you'll see the recordings and any handouts and other accompanying materials there, and you can watch those again at your leisure. A little more details on those invasive plant fact sheets. These have been completely redone. They describe some of the problems that I mentioned in the talk today, and they will list not just one, but multiple possible substitutes. If you click on the links from those invasive fact sheets, you'll be taken directly to fact sheets that describe the native plants that you might want to consider. Again, you can see the photographs and learn a lot more of the growing and maintenance tips. One resource that you'll want to consider if you're concerned about invasive plants are these two plant lists from Arlington and Alexandria. I wish these were a little more readily available, but they are available on the website, on their websites. So you could look at the lists of plants in case you're considering any new purchases of plants, and then you can go back to our mgnv.org website where I've created the detailed fact sheets and get more details on them. And to answer the question about sources for native plants, I recommend that you go to this website, the Plant Nova Natives website. They have a whole special section that talks about a variety of nurseries that deal exclusively in native plants. I know particularly that there are some right here in the Northern Virginia area. They have put COVID-19 protocols into place, and you can shop safely with those particular nurseries. So at this time, we'll take any remaining questions.
Okay, I got several for you. You just answered a couple of them about a native plant encyclopedia with photos for Northern Virginia. So I think Plant Nova Natives is not an encyclopedia, but a good first step on that. And somebody had asked for summary fact sheets, which they now know are available. So that's wonderful. We did get several questions about native shrubs for dry or drought resistance. Is there, I think you mentioned that was also, it was subdivided into plants that do well in those type of conditions. Is that correct?
Yes. If people want to look at what we call the best bets plant sheets, those are, will describe a variety of plants, trees, shrubs, perennials, and others for particular conditions. The one plant that I mentioned that was particularly drought resistant was the New Jersey tea, just because of its really deep root system. That one is one that comes to mind as especially adapted for dry conditions. And if people want to watch the recording of this presentation, they can go back through and look at the little tables that I provide for each of them. And of course, if they go to the fact sheets, they'll get much more information. They'll get information about when to prune the plants, which plants can be used underneath black walnut, which plants, again, which plants are deer resistant. So I would recommend looking especially at those fact sheets. If you've noted any plants as we've been going through, and you've maybe noted a couple on the handout that you'd like to find out more about, go to the fact sheets, and that will give you some of the details that you're looking for.
Okay, let's see. So somebody asked a very specific questions about shrub recommendations for soils that are in the 7 to 8 pH range.
Again, the fact sheets give, we actually provide the soil pH range. That'll be at the bottom of the fact sheet. We'll give the pH range, the sun and shade conditions, and the soil moisture conditions.
Okay, great. Somebody asked, should you mulch around the base of native plants or leave the ground with just the natural dirt around it?
Okay, in one of my previous presentations on pollinators, I mentioned that we're now asking people to try to leave the soil and at least some of the areas of their garden bare. The reason for that is that the large percentage, about 70% of our native bees are ground dwelling bees. They will make little holes, little tunnels down in the soil. And if you can allow at least some areas of your garden beds to be left bare, that will give them a place that they can use for their homes. Now, native bees will come out at different times of the year. Different species will emerge at different times. Some people were concerned that weeds might crop up if they didn't mulch. And one presentation that I attended recently said that if you had maybe just a very, very thin layer of mulch, that the bees would be able to dig down and to emerge through that. One other plant that has just come to mind in response to the earlier question about evergreens, and one that I did not mention, I'm not sure we have a fact sheet on this. It is evergreen, is our native rhododendron, the Rose Bay rhododendron. That's a fairly large rhododendron plant. Unlike the hybrid or the non-native rhododendrons, which have huge clusters of flowers that are maybe fuchsia, purple, lavender, pink, these are going to be white flowers, clusters of white flowers. But the leaves are evergreen, and the flowers are just tremendous magnets for not only bees but butterflies. So that's another choice. Leucothoe, jog hobble, Leucothoe azaleas is another one. We don't have a fact sheet on that. Jog hobble, that scientific name is spelled Leucoe, or C-O, I think, T-H-O-E, Leucothoe azaleas. That's one, I think it's native a little further south, but that is one that is evergreen, and I believe it's available from some of our native nurseries as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that was another question that we had. So, okay. Next question. Is it too hot for a sun part shade shrub if they are in the afternoon sun rather than the morning sun?
Well, I would say the morning sun is probably the best. The ones that I've indicated, I guess a good many of them I'm saying sun to part sun. As long as you're paying attention to the moisture, making sure that they're getting adequate moisture, measuring your rainfall. Most of them that are labeled full sun should take that. Again, the fact sheets will point out if certain plants tend to be a little sensitive to afternoon sun, to wind conditions, of other particular climatic conditions.
Okay, great. Can you train strawberry bush along a trellis or fence?
Well, I've never tried doing that. I don't tend to think of it as quite as flexible as some of our native vines, where you would definitely do that. It has a more delicate branching to it, and I suppose you might be able to weave those in and out if you did that when the branches were young. That would be almost like the espalier technique of shrubs.
Right.
I tend to think of it as a plant that is especially appealing in a more naturalistic kind of a setting. It is a forest understory plant, so I wouldn't tend to think of it being used in that more formal, controlled kind of a manner.
Okay. Is Clethra alifolia a good alternative for hydrangea in a shady area?
Yeah, I think it would be. Yes, both of those do well in a range of conditions, including shade. Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, and somebody had asked, you mentioned two sweet shrubs, Calycanthus florideus and Clethra, which might have been the one I just said. Are those the scientific names for those sweet shrubs?
That's the confusing thing about common names. You can have plants that have very similar common names, and that's why I'm providing the scientific names. That way, especially that the native plant sellers will tend to sell them with the scientific name. And if you have that, you can make sure that you're getting the very specific plant that you want. Let's see, just referring to that, let's see. So, sweet shrub, Calycanthus floridus, was the multi-stemmed one that had the maroon-colored flowers, the ones with the strap-like petals, and the fruitier fragrance. That one had the cultivar, the Athens cultivar, that was the lime green. The other bush that has sweet in its name is sweet pepper bush. That's the Clethra alnifolia. So just refer to if you can refer to the plant list that I provided, you can make sure you're getting the common name matched up with the scientific name, and request the proper plant if you decide you want to go to the nursery and purchase that.
Okay, thank you. How can you tell if you have a male or a female inkberry?
Boy, that is tricky, and in some of the nurseries will even have a challenge trying to tell. Hopefully, because those nurseries are aware that the plant is dioecious, they'll try to make an effort when they see a plant providing fruit that labeling that as the female. Sometimes there'll be distinctions in the way the flowers look, and they'll be able to discern that. But you'll have to consult with the growers, with the providers at the nursery to really tell those, because some of those distinctions are very subtle.
So if you had one in your yard, but you didn't know if it was male or female, you might have to resort to buying both.
That's right. Exactly.
All right. All right. Somebody asked, what does provide wildlife support mean? So on several slides, of course, you say that it provides wildlife support. What specifically do you mean by that?
Okay. I'm thinking of 3 different types of support. One is through the flowers. The flowers can be attractive to native bees. There are native flies, syrphid flies, flower flies, some beetles, other types of insects. Well, the butterflies, certainly the adult butterflies. They will come for nectar to provide sustenance for them. Some of the insects, like the native bees, will also, while they're collecting nectar for themselves, will collect pollen. They will take that pollen back to the nests. That will allow them to feed their young. That allows a whole new generation of insects to develop. So that's providing support through multiple generations of that insect's life. Hummingbirds are nectar feeders, and so they of course will enjoy that. They don't make any, some of them may actually get a little bit of pollen dropped on their heads as they're nectaring from tubular shaped flowers, and when they go to another plant they may spread that pollen, but they're not particularly well known as pollinators. So that's one type of wildlife support. The second type is if a plant has foliage that can be used by the caterpillar generation of moths and butterflies. We generally refer to them by the higher level designation Lepidoptera. It provides food for them so that they can develop into the next generation of our moths and butterflies. The adults will feed on the nectar, but the caterpillars have to have something to eat. They have to have the foliage. So the plants that I've mentioned that act as, quote, host plants, that's the function that they're providing. The third function that a native plant can provide is with its fruit. And that's when, I'm mostly thinking of birds, but other small animals may consume the fruit as well. So some of the plants that I've described can provide every single one of those types of support. And if you want to really provide services, what are referred to as ecosystem services in your landscape, not just do what Doug Tallamy, our well-known entomologist, says. He's the author of both Bringing Nature Home, which he wrote a number of years ago, and the brand new Nature's Best Hope. What he's asking home gardeners to do now is to garden not just for beauty, but to garden with the environment and our endangered wildlife in mind. And the nice thing about native plants is that they have really attractive features. They have beautiful flowers, they have attractive foliage, and they can support our wildlife at the same time. Referring to Doug Tallamy, with some studies that he did right here actually in the DC area, he found that gardens that had 70% native plants, and this is especially woody plants like trees and shrubs, can provide enough food for the moths and butterflies to allow their caterpillars to develop. Therefore, the birds, which a very large percentage, I think it's 95% of birds, feed their young caterpillars. The caterpillars that feed on the foliage will in turn feed the birds. So one home landscape can be, quotes, providing wildlife support to many different types of animals.
Can you can you spell Doug Tallamy's name for the folks again and rename the titles of the books you just held up?
Yes, I will. It's Doug Tallamy, Tallamy, and his earlier book is Bring Nature Home. His brand new book is Nature's Best Hope.
Okay.
And he gives a lot of practical tips. He's reiterating a lot of what I've been saying. The thing about Doug is when he made that point about gardens that have 70% native plants, he recognizes that homeowners may have some favorite non-native shrubs. You may love your mophead hydrangea. You may love your rose bushes. You may like your non-native azaleas. As long as you have benign non-natives, that's absolutely fine. And he feels that the 30% in the 100% formula, 30% is open and available to you to use the benign shrubs. But he's strongly recommending that people veer away from the invasive shrubs. And as I mentioned earlier, the ones that I've pointed out today are specifically problematic. They're on the plant lists for Arlington and Alexandria.
Okay, thank you. Well, one question we've gotten several times is, what is the plant behind your question slide?
That is possum haw, viburnum nudum, N-U-D-U-M. That's what it looks like in the fall with glorious fall foliage. And that was the plant where I pointed out how a cluster of fruit could have pink and purple and blue fruit all on it at the same time.
It's beautiful, that's for sure. I know you had a slide on this. Somebody has asked which natives can be pruned more formally. And I remember one of the slides you showed us had a couple that were pruned more formally.
Yes, that particular slide had Ilex glabra, which is the native inkberry holly, and it had Clethra alnifolia, the sweet pepper bush.
Okay.
I've seen those. I think the reason why the inkberry was trimmed was maybe to try to reproduce the look that some people get when they grow boxwood, because it has a similar leaf form. I would tend to let the plants pretty much grow, assume their natural shape. But that was just one example of how if you wanted a slightly more formal look, you could do that.
All right. Somebody had noted that in your yard there's lots of densely planted areas. Are these is most of your yard like high or low maintenance? And if it's high maintenance in a densely planted area, how do you work around that?
I have several different areas in my garden. The pictures that I showed, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can back up to that. Right here, I have, this is in the front of my yard, which is very sunny. And I have a densely planted area around a tree, and it has a variety of perennials and ground covers in it. And then these deep beds that are foundation plant beds beside the house and the garage, they're maybe about 10 feet deep. So I have the taller plants toward the back and the shorter ones to the front with native ground covers going in between. Those are fairly low maintenance. The biggest problem I have is with an invasive weed, a kind of a viney weed that likes to come up through them. And I just have to be careful that I don't let that snarl up through the shrubs and go to flower. My entire backyard is a forested area. It wasn't that way at all. It was all grass and in the baking hot sun. And over a period of about 15 years, I've brought in plants that have now grown taller and created a forest area. But you can use a really interesting mix of shrubs and perennials and ground covers in a bed. You can mix it up. And here, as I pointed out, this was not such a good idea to have a tree. It's a small tree, but it's still maybe a little large for that location. But here I have what's going to be a full-fledged tree, and it's completely surrounded, densely planted with pretty much native perennials. Here's a few non-natives tucked in there.
Okay, and I know on the MGNV website right now, we have a great article that shows your lawn, and it shows kind of how it started and what it looks like today, correct?
That is correct. It's an article that several of the Glencarlyn garden coordinators collaborated on, and we decided to show people what our individual yards looked like when we began. Mine was pancake flat, all grass, and a few rose bushes, and maybe two trees in the back, which eventually died. And now I don't have a single blade of lawn grass. I've got some hardscape running through the middle of it, and then in the back I have stepping stones. And so I just, over a very slow period of time, just allowed beds that were there to deepen and then created brand new beds. So this is a project that people can undertake over a period of time. You don't have to do it overnight.
Yeah, it's a wonderful article and shows how Elaine and several other master gardeners, kind of what they started with and what it looks like now. So I would encourage you guys to go on the website and read that. Okay, do you ever feed your native shrubs or trees?
I don't. No, that's the nice thing about the natives. If you build up your soil, healthy soil, then you're not going to need the fertilizers. If people take a look at one of the other presentations, it's one that I gave several weeks ago. It's called Climate Conscious Gardening. If you look at the recording of that, there's a section you can refer to on building healthy soil, and that will give people a lot of tips for helping create a condition where the plants will really flourish.
Okay. Another question, do you need to cut back wild hydrangea every year? And a lot of people wanted to know if they had other colors other than white.
Right. In the maintenance tips that I've had for that hydrangea, they really recommended, I mean, it grows so well. They recommended cutting it way back to the ground. I think a couple of years I only cut it back partially, and it ended up, the canes became kind of leggy, and the flowering was a little more dispersed. When I cut them back, I mean, these right here were cut back full to the ground, and they've now attained, they're even taller than this now. They've attained their full height, and they were absolutely covered with flowers. So I would really strongly recommend doing that. It just gives it fresh, healthy growth. It will be completely densely covered with the foliage and densely covered with the flowers. Now, if you like the multiple colors of the non-native hydrangea, the unfortunate thing about this is that it only, to my knowledge, it's only available in the native white. The one cultivar, Annabelle, had the huge clusters that are very similar to the mophead hydrangeas, but those are also white, not multicolored.
Okay. And we had another question, because I think you mentioned about the Annabelle, that it wasn't, well, somebody had said, is the Annabelle cultivar better than the mophead since it has the native base?
I would recommend it. I mean, if you're really crazy about the colorful flowers, maybe have one or two shrubs like that. But the Annabelle would be a way to get that similar mophead hydrangea look, and the foliage at least will be providing support for butterflies and moth caterpillars.
Okay, and with our pruning questions, somebody had just asked, so the rule about 1/3 cutback would not apply in that case. And somebody else had asked, are most of these plants prunable if they get too big?
Well, you'll definitely want to cut. I found that this just creates a healthier plant if you cut this back. I would say most of them would be prunable, and that 1/3 rule would apply. But again, you really want to think about right plant, right place. You don't want to plant right up, for example, right in front of this window. I wouldn't want to plant a plant that's going to get tall and have to be constantly cutting it to create the height that I want. That's why I'm trying to present a whole variety of plants, some of which are taller, some are shorter. Most of them, I think, are around that maybe 6 to 8 foot range. Some of them do get a little taller. But really think about that right plant, right place principle when you're doing your planting. You don't want to have to be constantly pruning things back severely in order to keep them from encroaching either on your home or on other plants.
Okay. So somebody asked, should I pull my Mahonia and non-native beautyberry? So I don't know if that's where you get to your, 70% versus 30%. And another question is, is there particular things that you need to consider if you're removing invasive plants before planting something native there?
Okay, I have to say that when I first moved into my home in 1985, there were some of these invasive plants, including nandina, in the yard. And so many of us have begun with those plants. Some of us unwittingly, before we learned about their invasive tendencies, actually went out and purchased them. What I did was I just retroactively went and I removed those plants. The safest thing would be maybe to put those in the trash rather than putting them in organic recycling, because as I pointed out, some of them can resprout from very small root portions. So if you are going to remove invasive plants, I would just put those directly in the trash. I didn't have to do anything special as far as soil treatment. I just wanted to, I guess the most important thing is to make sure that you've removed them as thoroughly as you can before you plant something new.
Okay. All right. Somebody specifically asked, does the low-scape mound plant flower and or have fruit?
Yes, and I'm very sorry I didn't include a photo of that to show you. It has all of the same characteristics as the straight species. That's the black chokeberry, the Aronia melanocarpa. That one, the low-scape mound is maybe a foot or so high. It's very diminutive. The full shrub grows about this tall. So mine are about 5 or 6 feet tall. The other is a very diminutive shrub, and it could actually be used as a really attractive little border plant as a ground cover. It has the same flowers, and as long as it gets pollinated, would have the same fruit. So that would be a really attractive option if you wanted to include that, but just in its smaller state. When you choose a cultivar for height, it's not going to have quite the same impact as if you choose a plant with different foliage or a different flower. If the foliage is different, as I mentioned, it won't provide the nutrition. And if a flower structure is different, it may be sterile. It won't have the nectar that the native straight species would have.
Okay, we're gonna finish up with just like 3 more questions. Do you have any suggestions for tall, narrow shrubs, either deciduous or evergreen?
A taller native shrub.
Tall, narrow, like
narrow one. Okay. This one, I didn't describe this one. I didn't feature it, but red chokeberry is considerable. It's taller and much more narrow than the black chokeberry. That one develops more heavily foliage covered branches lower down. The red chokeberry is a little taller and more open. Now this one can sucker, but if you didn't want it to spread extraordinarily, you could just cut those new developing shoots off at the base. So that would be one. There's a plant that is native to the United States, is native to the Southeast. It's not considered locally native. It's Yaupon holly, Yaupon. It's one in the ilex family, and that one has some narrow cultivars.
Okay, thank you. Can mountain laurel take afternoon sun?
I consider that really a forest understory plant. I would try to keep it away from that really strong sun.
Okay. And somebody asked, and we'll do two more. Somebody asked specifically, what's the tree at the corner of your house, right there on your slide?
This one right here.
Yes, I believe that's the one there.
This one, I was lucky enough, this is a native tree. I was lucky enough to have this planted through the Eco Action Arlington tree canopy program in the spring. It was planted professionally, completely free to me. It is a black gum, Nyssa, Nyssa sylvatica, Sylvatica. One other point I'd like to make about the mountain laurel, and this would be something people would see when they look at the fact sheets. Mountain laurel, the azaleas and rhododendrons, and the blueberries are what are referred to as ericaceous plants. That means that they're plants that they're in a whole plant family that tend to grow in much more acidic conditions, more forested conditions. So you'd want to do a soil test and make sure that those conditions were right for those plants. And as I mentioned, the fact sheets down at the bottom will give the range of soil acidity that's proper for that particular plant. So that the Kalmia latifolia, the mountain laurel, is definitely one to double check on the soil acidity.
Okay, thank you. And for our last question, we had somebody who asked, can you grow inkberry from seed or very small plants? Because sometimes when you go to the nursery, they only offer like, you know, quite significant plants, which can be quite pricey. Can you grow that from a cutting, or do you have any advice on that?
I have purchased all of my plants, but some of the local sellers will make them available in much smaller sizes than well, certainly the box stores and some of the bigger, more prominent nurseries that have multiple branches throughout the area. The native plant sellers are eager to get those plants to you, and they recognize that you can't always afford the more expensive plants. So they may have them more in the gallon size, or a couple gallon size, as opposed to the really robust plants that are going to look like this right out of as you install them. Right. Also, buying smaller plants is going to give you a better chance to get them adapted to your area and just get them off to a better start. So go to Plant Nova Natives and look for those native plant sellers, and you should be able to work with them to find something that's more reasonable. I've never heard of growing them from seed. They need a lot of special growing care, and it takes a while to get a plant to a shrub, even a small shrub height. Right. So the growers need to have special techniques for doing that.
Okay, and I know a lot of the native plant sales were canceled this year, but usually we have 2 sales where we invite some native sellers in, and that is someplace that folks can look in a regular year to pick up natives.
Yes, that's correct. That Plant Nova Native site, in addition to listing the year-round plant sellers, in normal conditions would list a whole variety of plant sales, not just in our immediate area, Arlington, Alexandria, but in the broader Northern Virginia area. And some of the sellers are even down in Central and Southern Virginia.